It all began in 1972 with a bunch of Silicon Valley rebels who quit their boring 9-to-5 engineering jobs to pursue a computer game's dream. Their founding father was 28-year-old Nolan Bushnell, who bluffed and bartered his way into business with just $500 in capital. He set up a company named after his favorite board game, Go.
In Japanese, when you're about to engulf an opponent's group, you politely warn them Atari. And I thought that was a good aggressive name for a company.
Despite his chronic lack of funds, Bushnell went all out to court his first Atari engineer.
Nolan showed up one day and took me to lunch in his bright, shiny new Oldsmobile station wagon and offered me $1,000 a month salary and some stock in the company. The Vietnam War was going on. I was pretty much questioning authority, and if you told me I couldn't do something, I was going to do it. Off I went. When we started Atari, it was the first thing we walk into this empty building. It was kind of a scary feeling in a little company with no support. There were just three of us there. Wow, this is the old place.
Here in this small workshop, Pong, the first great computer game, was born.
That's where I sat and wired the first Pong machine.
Pong was actually started as really a training project.
He stretched the truth a little bit, told me he had a big contract from General Electric.
No engineer wants to work on a throwaway project.
The fact that nobody from General Electric ever called or came by or wrote us a letter never occurred to me. This might not be true.
The first thing that Al did was to get the paddles to work, then the ball to move. And then we added the feature that where the ball impacted the paddle would determine the angle that it would bounce off. And at that change, the game was fantastically fun.
But would the public agree? Bushnell and Alcorn installed their hastily assembled prototype in their local tavern to find out.
We put it in a wooden box that had sticky-backed contact paper on it. I mean, it was real tacky. Slapped a coin box from an old kiddie ride on the side of it and put it on top of a barrel.
We sat back, got a beer, sat by a pinball machine, and watched what happened.
One of the regulars approached the machine and studied the ball bouncing silently around the screen. He inserted a quarter, and the game began. Eventually, he realized that two small knobs controlled the paddles and played his first shot. A small crowd soon gathered round to watch.
Up till then, people had never seen anything on a TV set that didn't come from a studio. And I can remember one girl asking me, how do you get the signal from what I turn here down to the TV station? The fact that the whole signal could be generated there locally was baffling to them. We watched it for a while and then we went home. The next day they called in and said the machine's broken, and we said, oh no. The machine was open and we found that the problem was that it was so full of quarters it wouldn't take anymore. I thought, that's a problem we can solve.
When Nolan saw how well the Pong was doing, how much money it was making, he said to himself, I got a hit on my hands and we're going to go into manufacturing.
Atari was on its way. Bushnell rented the cheapest space he could find, a disused roller skating rink, and they set up their first factory.
Everybody in the company, when I said we're going to build 100 machines a day, said, Nolan, you're absolutely crazy.
We knew so little about it, we actually went to the unemployment office and actually just hired people off the street, and there were parolees, there were bad guys. It was pretty shocking how amateur it was.
Within 6 weeks to 2 months, we were at 100 machines a day.
Word got around and the orders for Pong started flooding in. 10,000 cabinets for the U.S. alone.
It just took the country by storm. We were 24 years old and not far out of college, and we'd done something that already touched the world.
On an initial investment of $500, Atari made its first million. An even greater success soon followed, with a home version of Pong.
I felt that the home game market could potentially be huge. Al came to me one day and said, I think we can put this all on a chip and build it cheap enough that we can go into the home. And I said, let's do it.
This is one of the actual first Pong chips, so all the logic that was in the coin-op game, these chips cost us, $10 a piece, and we could build a game and sell it for $100.
Finding someone to sell home Pong was a tougher challenge.
We could not get a single toy store anywhere in the nation to buy any. And then one of our guys thought, well, let's try the sporting goods department at Sears.
Sears ordered 150,000 units of home Pong to be delivered in time for Christmas 1975. It was stylishly designed to appeal to both adults and children and branded with the Sears Telegames logo. It was make or break time for Atari. Again. Sears put their marketing might behind home Pong. The 1973 arcade sensation was now available as the ultimate home gadget.
One commercial ran, and they were completely sold out. And that was wonderful.
Atari had made the big time.
Slowly but surely, we built new games, different games.
Bushnell's focus returned to the arcades. He was determined to stay one step ahead of his rivals.
We just took this attitude that we were going to give our competitors no safe quarter. And we outmarketed them, we outbuilt them, we out-innovated them.
Engineering in action.
To make the best games, Bushnell needed the best engineers. So he made Atari the most fun company to work for on the planet. New recruit David Crane was a big fan of Bushnell's eccentric management style.
Neat was a word you heard from Nolan quite often. If he said, "Oh, that's neat," he would want to make it, thinking that if he found it neat, other people would find it neat.
Bushnell inspired his brilliant young engineers to innovate constantly.
My attitude was that if you personally believe strongly in your idea, give it a try.
Bushnell's currency was ideas, and no idea was too wacky to be considered.
Everybody had to come up with a couple of silly ideas. We called that compost. These were the ideas that were germinating. Sometimes they would come to life.
The free flow of creativity produced a string of smash hit games, keeping Atari at the top of the industry. But then came the lawsuit. It seemed that Bushnell may have lifted his very first idea from someone else. The lawsuit claimed that just months before Atari was formed, Bushnell had seen a game at a trade show that was almost identical to Pong. A TV set designer called Ralph Baer had been thinking about computer games since the early 50s. In 1966, his ideas crystallized while he was waiting at a bus stop on a business trip to New York.
When I got back to the office the next morning, it was September 1st, 1966, I wrote a 4-page memo. In it, I lay out the whole thing. I proposed such things as sports games, chase games, race games, car games.
Baer set to work on his invention. By 1968, he had his first television games console working, which he simply called his brown box. His first game was a chase game in which 2 pixels chased each other around the screen. Quickly followed by a ping pong game. This was still 4 years before Bushnell and Alcorn came up with Pong. TV manufacturers Magnavox signed up Baer and produced a refined version of the brown box. The Odyssey played 12 different games. Each game came with a color overlay that was stuck on the screen to enhance the primitive graphics. As well as controllers, Bear even came up with the first light gun for shooting games, an invention years ahead of its time. The Odyssey was launched at a trade show in New York in 1972.
It was absolutely the hit of the show, and everybody was very enthusiastic, as was the press.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, 12 exciting electronic games you play through your own TV.
At another trade show in Silicon Valley on May 24th that year, an interesting name appeared in the visitor's book, Nolan Bushnell.
And he played the Odyssey game hands-on and played the ping pong game.
The fact is that I absolutely did see the Odyssey game, and I saw it and I didn't think it was very clever.
Whether Bushnell was inspired by the Odyssey or not, Ralph Baer had patented his own designs.
This is the patent which, and if you look in the fine print up here, you can see that it was first filed January of 1968. There is a television set down here. Underneath is two hand controls on each side.
Based on Baer's patents, Magnavox sued Atari.
Our position was always very clear. We said, we will only settle this for less than it'll cost us to defend it.
After 4 years of negotiations, Bushnell and Baer met for the first time on the steps of the federal court in Chicago in 1976. Rather than go before a judge, Bushnell and his lawyer agreed to pay a license fee in recognition of Baer's patents.
Within days, they had an agreement for a prepaid license for a very reasonable amount. He really got away from everything.
Magnavox accepted a settlement of $400,000. Ralph Baer won justice, but none of the international acclaim that Bushnell enjoyed.
He was characterized as the father of video games because he was always out there in front of the cameras, and I'm behind the scenes with the lawyers telling me, cool it, Baer, right? He's a licensee. Cool it. Right?
25 years on, Baer's now retired and suffering from leukemia. But he's determined to finish his autobiography and set the record straight over the true origins of computer games. For Bushnell, the settlement came cheap. Atari was already making millions. But as the arcades entered a golden era of popularity, Atari faced a new threat in the form of an unstoppable, world-conquering game from Japan. In 1978, Taito released a game that became so popular in Japan, it caused a national 100-yen coin shortage. Space Invaders sold over 350,000 machines around the world and inspired a renaissance of creativity in arcade games. Atari responded with their own brand of shoot-'em-ups and space games. Nolan Bushnell's brilliant young engineers pioneered a new technology called vector graphics with a striking new look. In 1979, Asteroids became Atari's all-time bestseller. Atari had another massive hit with Battlezone's 3D graphics, which even inspired a training version for the U.S. Army. Arcades sprang up everywhere. Teenagers and young adults all over the world spent every spare moment and all their spare cash in these dark, smoky caverns. The backlash from parents and politicians was inevitable. The press was full of stories from around the world of truancy and delinquency. Arcades were branded as evil dens where kids were led astray. But Atari had a solution. In 1975, Atari's engineers had secretly started work on a radical new concept, a game system for the home using cartridges that would play arcade games.
So here we have the first prototype of the Atari VCS cartridge video game system. It has all the things you need in a prototype. We had the actual logic wire wrap board here and some joysticks and controls from the tank game. We figured we knew we needed this game, had to play Pong, had to play Tank, and had to do the driving games. And beyond that, we weren't sure what we were going to do with it.
The VCS was launched in 1977. It had a stylish faux wood exterior, cleverly designed switches, and the first home console joysticks. Since Atari were the #1 producers of arcade hits, they were able to produce a whole series of must-have VCS conversions. And in 1980, Atari bought the home video game rights to Space Invaders.
Atari Space Invaders are here. Now you can play the world's most popular arcade game in your own home. Space Age action on your own.
That Christmas, millions of VCS consoles were sold, just so that teenagers could play Space Invaders at home.
Now from Atari, a great new video game, Pac-Man.
Atari's revenues made it the fastest growing company in U.S. history. But the company's meteoric rise attracted the attention of major players. Warner Communications made Bushnell an offer he couldn't refuse. They bought out Atari for $28 million, an extraordinary return on a startup capital of $500.
It was a lot of money in those days. It was more money than I ever thought I'd make.
But it was the beginning of the end for Atari. Bushnell was soon at odds with the new owners.
We were just launching the VCS, and I said, well, you know, the VCS is over. And they say, what? I said, well, no, you have to think of it that way. And they were horrified.
The new Warner bosses were unimpressed with how the company was run.
They were New Yorkers, and they didn't understand it. They thought it was very, very bizarre. And they set about, piece by piece, really dismantling the corporate culture and fundamentally destroying the company. It was the damnedest thing I'd ever seen.
A series of showdowns with the new bosses eventually inevitably led to Bushnell being removed. He was paid off and shown the door. The industry had lost its pioneering visionary. But Atari's problems weren't over. Under the new regime, star designers like David Crane found they were no longer valued for their role in the company's extraordinary success.
There were a lot of promises made that weren't kept.
We had some very key engineers that were doing the cartridges for the home games that were making like $50,000, $60,000 a year. In 3 or 4 months, they'd produce the software for a cartridge that would sell $100 million worth of stuff, and these engineers could do the math.
If they really didn't think we were worth more than the person who put screws in the plastic, then we were at the wrong company.
David Crane and 3 other top designers left Atari and set up their own company, Activision. After 2 years of legal wrangles with Atari, they won the right to design and publish their own games for the VCS. Crane himself designed the VCS's most successful game of all time, Pitfall.
Every game we developed sold 500,000 units at least, so they were all hits. And then when Pitfall came out and sold many millions of units, it was the biggest. What we were developing at that time with Pitfall was the first platform game.
Activision rekindled the creative spirit of the early days at Atari, but it also unwittingly triggered a disaster.
A lot of business people saw only our success and unfortunately flooded the market with product that nobody wanted to buy.
Atari contributed to a public loss of confidence in computer games with poor quality products like E.T.
It's coming soon.
Millions of copies of this game ended up as landfill.
Help E.T. get home.
The market for computer games crashed, and in 1983, Warner announced second quarter losses of over $250 million, and their shares plummeted.
I absolutely regret the Warner sale. I think it was the stupidest thing I ever did.
In 1984, Warner sold off Atari, and American computer games were declared dead. But elsewhere, a new breed of 12-year-old game designers was resurrecting the industry in their bedrooms, and they were about to become teenage millionaires. In the early 80s, in classrooms, schoolyards, and bedrooms, British teenagers were plotting a revolution. They were the nerdiest kids in school, sci-fi geeks who were good at math but had few friends. But they were about to make millions.
It started as a hobby, and yes, it turned into obsession, turned into a career, I guess.
Twins Philip and Andrew Oliver were typical British teenagers. Their parents wouldn't let them have a TV game console, but computers were considered educational. Just at the right time, a whole series of cheap personal computers, like the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64, came on the market. Thousands of British parents bought them for their kids to help with their homework, but the kids had other ideas. Without anyone to tell them otherwise, they discovered they could make their own games, as good as the arcades, and even better.
The leading edge was what was happening in the arcades. But the problem with arcades was they had to kind of take your 10p or 20p and give you only 1 minute's worth of fun. Whereas the computer games, kids can play it all evening, every evening if they want.
The Oliver twins taught themselves how to write game programs from scratch. In 1982, at just 13 years old, they submitted their first game to a games magazine, and it was published. The game was called Roadrunner.
It was just so cool to be able to sort of go into school and say, look, that's our work, and just like run through it with kind of other kids. It was just blocks of single colours. It kind of raced up the screen and the track moved down the screen. And we used to challenge each other, how long can you last? It slowly got narrower and narrower and twistier with good random in there. So it'd eventually knock you off.
The magazine paid them $75, a lot of extra pocket money for two 13-year-olds. Next came an opportunity to be on television. They entered a game into a competition for a kids' TV show.
We wrote a game, sent it in, and we won first prize, and we appeared on television. And that was kind of great, but it was so funny because they said afterwards, we were the only one that actually sent in a game. They didn't actually mean for people to write games. They wanted you to design on paper, wouldn't it be cool if a character did this and this, whereas we'd actually written a game.
Offers to buy their games flooded in, and the twins' hobby turned into a cottage industry.
We did a whole series of games here. First few. There's this Killer P and KV. There were many times where you just worked straight through the night and you had school in the morning, and we just sort of like break up, like you're going to do all the arrows shooting and boulders dropping, and you're going to do this, and you'd go to sleep and you'd wake up and it's like, oh cool, there's a new feature in the game. We just keep working and working and working. It was starting to get suspicious when you had birds tweeting at the window and it was getting brighter outside. You know? And you hear the milk float. Yeah.
Publishers distributed their games all over the country, but the twins got paid very little. By the time they were 18, their parents thought it was time they went to college and got a real job. But a teacher persuaded the parents to give the boys 1 year to turn their hobby into a business. And a few weeks later, everything changed when they met the Darling brothers. Richard and David Darling had also been inventing their own games since they were 11 and 12 years old. But they were unhappy with the token amounts of money that game companies were offering teenage designers. So they sold their games by mail order, setting up their own company in a spare room at home. They duplicated their games on cassette, printed their own artwork, and eventually sold 1 million copies. At just 17 and 18, they set up their own games publishing company, Codemasters. And at their first trade show, they met the 18-year-old Oliver twins.
The Oliver twins came in and we sat down and they showed us a demo of one of the games they'd done previously.
They're going, a game like that, yeah, we'll give you £10,000 for it. we were just staggered.
If they've said that their jaws hit the floor and they were very excited, they must have concealed that quite well.
We couldn't get home fast enough, and we just didn't sleep. Within about a month, we wrote Super Robin Hood, which went straight to #1. By Christmas, we'd sold 100,000 units and made £10,000, and in fact it carried on selling, so we actually made a little bit more. Just couldn't believe it. But of course, the minute it started selling, we just couldn't stop, so we just started rattling out more games for Codemasters.
It was one of the most successful collaborations in computer game history.
We worked out that 50% of all Codemaster games were actually written by us.
The Oliver twins were also working on a secret project. They wanted to invent something radically new, a game centered on an animated character. That character was Dizzy.
We wanted this fantasy world. I had this idea, we should get the character's face as big as possible on screen to give it a bit of personality. They got an awful lot of fan mail in at Codemasters all about it and asking how do you do this and how do you do that, and every time we went up they go, oh, we got some more fan mail.
Dizzy was an international hit. The games topped bestseller charts all around the world.
One stage we had different Dizzy games at number 1, 2, 3 in the charts, which is a bit like the Beatles of the games industry.
Teenage computer game millionaires became national celebrities, hitting the headlines and showing off the spoils of their success.
There were quite a few Ferraris bought by people who'd kind of just passed their test, but those Ferraris didn't last very long, I don't believe.
The result of all this hard labor was a massive creative contribution to game design. These were games designed by gamers for gamers. Thanks to the home computer era, Britain now contributes more game designers and programmers to the games industry than any other country.
I remember saying to a journalist, it's like, one day this will be bigger than TV. I mean, right now, the UK games industry actually has bigger export than the British film and TV put together.
But back in the early 80s, while British teenagers were the stars of the home computer era, new stars were also rising in the East. The center of the industry was about to shift again. The computer games industry that began with Atari on the west coast of America 30 years ago is now dominated by Japan. Computer games have become almost synonymous with Japan, and it's largely thanks to an extraordinary series of character-based games, all developed in the 80s by a single creative genius. Not since Walt Disney has one man had such ability to touch the hearts and minds of millions of children throughout the world. Shigeru Miyamoto.
At some point, I realized that games could actually draw out people's emotions. Since then, my own childhood memories have been reflected in my games.
Miyamoto grew up in Sonobe, a small country town near Kyoto. As a young child in his traditional family home, he turned his surroundings into a fantasy world to explore.
He was sort of in his mind a lot, and he spent a lot of time by himself, and he spent a lot of time daydreaming. And the way he played as a child was something that he retained as an adult when he started to do this work. I remember him describing a walk through a sort of wooded park near his home, and he had an imagination that was just extraordinary. He was just envisioning all the things that were going on that we couldn't see, all the pathways that would lead you somewhere. Looked up and imagined, what if it wasn't actually a piece of blue sky that he saw above him, but it was actually a secret trapdoor that would enter to a new world.
In 1980, Miyamoto brought his vision and imagination to Nintendo. Based in the ancient capital of Kyoto, the company had been manufacturing Hanafuda, traditional Japanese playing cards, for nearly 100 years. But when its president Hiroshi Yamauchi saw the success of games like Space Invaders, he turned Nintendo into a computer games company. Now in his early 20s, Miyamoto had no interest in computer games, but his father wanted him to have a respectable job.
Miyamoto was a spacey, flighty, really imaginative artist. The last place he ever expected himself to wind up would be in a big company.
I hated computers. I didn't trust intangible things like electricity.
The next twist of fate was a crisis call from America. Nintendo had established a small U.S. headquarters in Seattle. The arcade era was booming, with Atari at the forefront, and Nintendo wanted a piece of the action. Nintendo of America had ordered 2,000 units of a hit Japanese game called Radarscope, but in America, the game was a disaster. Head office in Kyoto was asked to create a replacement game. Without a single designer available, it was decided that it was time to give their youngest recruit his big break.
Miyamoto was completely baffled and completely overwhelmed with the idea. He started to do the research. He spent time in arcades, and he spent time with kids who were playing games and tried to understand what they were about. And he started to have this vision of video games being more like movies. Why couldn't they tell stories?
Miyamoto created a simple story and colorful cartoon characters for his groundbreaking new game.
Let me show the first sketch I drew for Donkey Kong. The gorilla escapes from the cage, snatches the girl, and runs away with her. The man chases him, dodging all these barrels with a hammer in his hand. At the end, a hole appears in the ground, and the gorilla falls down, and he dies.
To bring his characters to life, Miyamoto had to work within the limits of the technology of the time.
All of a sudden there was a question, what kind of hair did this guy have? The problem is if he's falling in a video game, you'd have to have his hair do something that the designers just couldn't deal with at the time, which is inertia would make his hair blow up, and it would sort of be sticking up as he was falling down. So the way that Miyamoto solved that problem was he gave him this little red hat.
As a final touch, Miyamoto wrote his own music for the game, and it was shipped out to Seattle. It remained to be seen whether Donkey Kong would have more success than the failed Radar Scope game it was supposed to replace.
People in America saw this game and thought that the Japanese, their Japanese counterparts were insane.
Fearing the worst, Nintendo's American team decided to try out the game in a local bar, just as Atari did with Pong a decade earlier.
A day later, they go back to the Spot Tavern, open the little coin box, and lo and behold, there's $30 in quarters in that little coin box. It's almost overflowing. That says that machine was operating almost every minute that tavern was open from noon until midnight when it closed that day. And I said, wow, what kind of aberration is this? That's all the market research I need. Let's go.
The game made $100 million in the first year alone. And Donkey Kong went on to become an international star with a whole series of hit games. Donkey Kong's original companion, Jumpman, went on to even greater fame and fortune. In 1985, Nintendo announced the launch of a new home console for the American market, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. Following the collapse of the US games industry, most observers thought they were crazy, but Nintendo had a secret weapon. Miyamoto took computer games to a whole new level with his next great creation. Jumpman was reincarnated as an Italian plumber called Mario. Mario had instant universal appeal.
Mario can do amazing physical things, like high jumps. But he's not superhuman. He drowns in water and gets hurt if he falls from high places.
Miyamoto created a side-scrolling world for Mario to explore, full of pipes, sewers, ledges, and cliffs, and he created an entire army of colorful cartoon monsters for him to fight.
In the early test version, Mario was very big. Next I created Small Mario. The game became more interesting with both. Then I wondered what kind of magic food could transform Small Mario into Big Mario. So I created that unwholesome-looking red mushroom.
He was making these wondrous universes that it was like falling through the looking glass.
The sequels soon followed, and Mario became an international superstar. In a 1987 survey, he was recognized by more American children than Mickey Mouse. Then Miyamoto unveiled his masterpiece. Nintendo released the first of a series of games that has been widely acclaimed as the greatest games ever made, the Zelda series. The Legend of Zelda moved beyond platforms and levels. It offered players a vast magical world to roam and freely explore.
The story begins with a child standing in the middle of a field. He doesn't have a sword or a shield. The player starts by naming the child, but then he has no idea what to do. He wanders around the field looking for things to do. It was a very daring concept back then.
Zelda was inspired by Miyamoto's childhood wanderings in the countryside around his home.
I walked up into the mountains, through woods and a rocky space, and finally I came to a big lake. I was so surprised to find such a big lake high up in the mountains. It looked like a vast ocean. This image is used a lot in Zelda. I provided lots of different items to discover in Zelda. These items are there to help the hero grow from a small child to accomplished adult. When the child grows up, the player thinks, I used to be scared of this, but now I'm very strong. That's the kind of game I wanted to make.
Taking over 100 hours to play, The Legend of Zelda perplexed, fascinated, and consumed players all over the world. It was a sensation that broke all the rules and defined a genre that has dominated game design ever since. By the end of the 80s, Nintendo sold over 30 million NES consoles, hundreds of millions of games, and it held an extraordinary 85% share of the entire world games market. Nintendo became the ultimate boss of the game industry game. It was about to prove it with a radical new game system that would appeal to boys, girls, and even adults. All it needed was the perfect game to launch it. But to get that game, they would need to wrestle it away from the iron grip of the Russian KGB. In the late 80s, a friendship between two game designers was forged behind the Iron Curtain. A friendship that would make one of these men famous and the other rich, and make Nintendo's Game Boy the most successful games machine ever. The key to that friendship was a game called Tetris. In 1988, Dutch-born game designer and publisher Hank Rogers was in the business of importing new games to Japan.
I first found Tetris in 1988 at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, which is what I did. I used to go around the shows and find the games that I liked and bring them back to Japan. That was the business I was in. I played it, and then I went away and came back and played it again, and I went away and I came back and played it again. There was a really solid core game there. I just went after the game.
Now living in Seattle, Alexei Pajitnov created Tetris in Moscow in 1984. Pajitnov was working on artificial intelligence and voice recognition software, and originally designed Tetris as an exercise to test out a new computer.
My interest all the time was in small puzzles and games and all these small mathematical diversions.
Tetris was based on a traditional Russian puzzle called Pentamenos.
There are 12 different shapes like that, and these are all the possible pieces made out of 5 squares.
Pajitnov's version of Pentamenos had pieces made from 4 squares instead of 5. He called it Tetris from the Greek word tetra, meaning 4.
When I wrote the procedure which rotates at 90 degrees, I liked you push the keys and the chuck, push the key, chuck, and the idea of the game of real time come to me.
Pajitnov's genius was to make Tetris a race against the clock. Completed lines were cleared from the screen, making it possible to carry on playing almost indefinitely. But as the pieces descended more and more quickly, the challenge got progressively harder.
As the game gets faster, your mind is no longer able to think that fast. Maybe it's your subconscious that's playing Tetris at this point, but it's playing faster than you can actually play. And I think athletes have this. We call it a zone.
Tetris spread through the Soviet bloc to Hungary, where it was discovered by Robert Stein. Stein went to Moscow where he met Alexei Pajitnov and negotiated a license to publish the game.
For some unknown reason, he gave me his original Tetris. It was licensed to be published on everything. That's what I thought.
In the West, Tetris became the biggest international sensation since Space Invaders.
When Tetris invaded the office, productivity went down to zero.
It eventually had to be banned.
In Japan, Hank Rogers released a version for Nintendo's home console.
We released this Tetris at the Christmas of 1988. We ended up selling 3 million.
And that was when Hank Rogers was given a sneak preview of Nintendo's Game Boy.
I said, you know, I think I have the perfect game for Game Boy.
But Rogers faced stiff competition from Robert Stein to secure the handheld rights for Tetris.
Excuse me, I discovered this product, so shouldn't I have it?
And so I got on the next plane.
Without realizing it at the time, Rogers and Stein flew out to Moscow on exactly the same day. They stayed in the same hotel, but never saw each other.
The TV doesn't work. The radio doesn't work. Everybody's imagination about what it was like behind the Iron Curtain in those days. All those things were there. You know, it was just very scary.
Rogers went to Moscow knowing nothing about the Soviet Union and speaking no Russian. He knew he was looking for an organization called L-Org, and that was it. To his surprise, he had no difficulty in hiring an interpreter who spoke perfect English.
Your name is Allah. All these guys are KGB. There's no way that you're going to get an interpreter who's just there to help you do business.
This is the building,
Yeah, this
yes?
is the building, right. Every meeting has to be cleared through the KGB. And of course, I came out of the clear blue sky. Finally, Mr. Belikov came down, and I explained that I'm the one who published Tetris in Japan. And he said, which machine is this? And I said, it's for Nintendo. He says, but we never gave these rights to anybody. I really thought that I was in deep kimchi for a large part of that time there, the beginning time, you know, because I was, in their eyes, I was a pirate.
Later that morning, Rogers met Alexei Pajitnov.
I introduce our other guest. Our other guest is Mr. Pajitnov.
Hello.
The world famous Mr. Pajitnov.
World famous? Why?
World famous why? Because in the world.
I am Alexei Pajitnov.
We became friends very quickly because, you know, when you're talking about game design, you have something, you have a common ground to talk about. And his English wasn't that good, but it was good enough.
Hank was the very first person who really loves and understood the game. And that's what I felt immediately.
Everybody, including Alexei in Moscow at this time, was paranoid that any conversation that was being had would be heard by people that shouldn't hear it. So anytime he wanted to really talk to me about something, he would wink, wink, or whatever, and we would go to the park.
Finally, the negotiations for the handheld rights for Tetris began.
Gosh, it was 8 to 10 people there, some of whom were definitely KGB, and it was total third degree. I was in that room and they were questioning me about everything.
What Rogers didn't know was that the Russians were also negotiating with Robert Stein in another room in the same building.
My objective was to try to get as much of the licenses, what is left, to be had.
Unknown to either of them, the chairman of UK game publishers Mirrorsoft was also in Moscow. Kevin Maxwell, son of newspaper magnate Robert Maxwell.
Kevin was pulling strings. He's saying, if you don't do this deal with me, my dad's going to talk to Gorbachev, and you guys are going to be in deep trouble. And that was his negotiating method.
But Rogers had Pajitnov on his side, and he had Nintendo's support to offer a generous deal.
4 days of negotiation, and finally they said yes.
Pajitnov and Rogers celebrated in the only Japanese restaurant in Moscow. The deal made Rogers a multi-millionaire.
I hated him, and yet he just done what any businessman would have done, you know. Today, I have lost God knows how many millions of dollars, and I wasn't very happy about it.
The biggest winner was Nintendo. With Tetris as its packed-in game, 32 million Game Boys were sold around the world, nearly half of them to adults. Pajitnov became world famous and immigrated to the United States. As a Soviet citizen, he earned nothing from the game until 1996, when the original deals expired, 12 years after he first invented it. He and Hank Rogers are now in business together, selling Tetris to a new generation of gamers on a new generation of hardware. With Tetris, the game industry finally came of age, and it made Nintendo, for a while at least, the most powerful entertainment company on the planet. From humble beginnings, computer game culture evolved at an incredible rate, thanks to the vision and creativity of its great pioneers. These are the men that understood how much the human race likes and needs to play. They opened the gates to a wondrous new world, and once inside, there's no turning back.
Chronicles of a revolution, a new world rising, and the battle for world domination. Get down. Cyber wars. Villains, visionaries, renegades, and heroes step into this brave new world and see how computer games changed our world and lead our future. Cyber Wars continues tomorrow night on Ultimate Discovery.